Homebrewed Christianity. This is Bo Sanders. And a while ago, I got to sit down with our friend Ryan Parker from Pop Theology. They're hosted over at Patheos now, to talk about the movie 12 Years a Slave. We were given the ability to go in and see a sneak peek of the movie, and we held on to it for a little bit because we wanted to wait until there was a broader chance for people to see it when it was released in several more cities. So, for the first 12 minutes, if you have not seen the movie, you may want to skip that part as there's some spoilers in there. And then you can come back in the 13th minute there. And it's in the 37th minute or so that we turn theological. So, we want to thank Seattle School of Theology for sponsoring us today. Seattle School of Theology focuses on educating the whole person through scripture and tradition with personal formation and cultural engagement. This practical approach equips pastors, therapists, social sector leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs with the intellectual capacity, emotional intelligence, and cultural competency they need to thrive in their vocation. Students learn to build transformative relationships with their clients, parishioners, and communities to fulfill the mission of the church and engage the kingdom of God. Seattle School offers master levels degree in divinity, theology and culture, and counseling psychology. You're invited to learn more about the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology degree and their programs at the seattleschool.edu. So, without further ado, here is our conversation Ryan and I had, 12 Years a Slave. It goes on for about an hour and 12 minutes. And remember, there's 12 minutes at the beginning. We recap the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to skip that because there's some spoilers in there. Let us know your feedback. Come to the website. Use the speak pipe to let us know. You can also reply at the bottom of this blog, and I will link to, I wrote a theological review, and Ryan wrote one about the movie itself, and I will link to both of those. Don't forget to share the brew. Hello. Welcome to Homebrewed Christianity. We have a guest in the house, J. Ryan Parker from Pop Theology.
Hi.
You are hosted over at Patheos now.
Yeah. Made the move.
So my name is Bo Sanders from Homebrewed Christianity, and Ryan and I got a chance this week, a special screening ahead of time for 12 Years a Slave. And we have each put up some reviews of it. I'm very excited about having the conversation with people as they get a chance to see this movie. It's in limited release right now. It's going to have a broad release soon. So we know that this is going to be a developing conversation where folks like us who have seen it ahead of time have to kind of wait and for people to get the chance to see it. But the early indications are not only is this going to be a significant movie for our cultural conversation, but it is going to play a major role in the Oscar season this coming year is kind of the expectation. So This is going to be an ongoing, I think over this year, some people will see it early, and then some people, if it gets an Oscar nomination, will go and see it for that reason. But this is going to be an ongoing thing. So we're going to talk about the movie today, knowing that not everybody's going to see it the first day it's out, but as an ongoing conversation piece and something we really want to be a part of with this cultural conversation. So here's the overview, kind of the game plan for today. And for those of you who are new to Homebrewed Christianity, it's a conversational podcast. We have different guests and authors and thinkers on. We try and bring in somebody who knows more about the topic that we're talking about that day than we do. And that's why you're here today. So after I give the kind of game plan for today, why don't you give everybody a little sketch of your background and why you are our guest today?
Yeah, and I think also that this is a film that people can still listen to this podcast before they see the movie.
Okay.
There's really no spoilers to be given at all, really. So feel free to listen, hear our thoughts about it, but then go see it and then...
So we're going to do an overview of the movie. If you are planning on seeing it and you don't want to know some of that stuff, you can skip the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about the film as a film.
Yeah.
And that's going to lead us into some societal stuff, some cultural stuff that needs to be addressed. And we're going to touch on some theological concerns, since this is a Theology podcast. And then at the end, we want to wrap up by talking about what may be ahead for this movie. So that's the game plan for today. So why don't you give us a little snapshot about your interest in film and why you are my conversation partner today.
I have been writing about pop culture and religion, film and religion for maybe 6 or 7 years at Pop Theology, and we recently transitioned over to Pathos for 3 or 4 months. I've completed a PhD in film and religion at the Graduate Theological Union, which is up in Berkeley. Focused a lot on the history of film, particularly the history of religious cinema, contemporary religious cinema, and thought I'd want to teach for a while. Market is such that it was going to be extremely difficult to try to move into that world. And so my wife Amy and I decided to consider an alternate path. Came down to LA, where we are now, and wanted to work in film. And so we've been here for about 3 or 4 months, taking advantage of all these opportunities, advanced screenings and things like that. So currently interning at a couple of production companies and looking into transitioning into work in creative development in film, maybe television now.
And that's why you're here, because you are a film buff, a student, and kind of a theorist. I mean, you've written extensively on it. So,
yeah, I think so. And
I just like watching movies.
And then also, I watched this movie with you.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So here's a little background real quick before we talk about the movie, just about how we got to see it.
Yeah.
So the other night, Ryan and I are sitting right now in the Loft LA. A couple nights ago, this room was filled because we had a Homebrewed Christianity live event with Reza Aslan, author of Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. The people who do his promotions, different drum. Bob called us and asked if we wanted to see a movie that he thinks is going to be important, and so we went over to a kind of a small screening in LA at the Fox Studios, and we got to go out afterwards and talk with Bob about it, and kind of come up with a game plan about how we might approach letting people hear some of our thoughts on this and inviting them into a conversation as they see it. So let's talk about the film. Why don't you give us an overview, just in case people have not seen it, to speed on what this film's about.
So the film is based on a true story about a man named Solomon Northup, who was born a free black man in Saratoga, New York, in the mid-1800s. Lived a life there. He was a talented violin player, was married, and had 2 young children. And they didn't make this clear in the film, but for some reason his wife periodically went away for work and would be gone
3 weeks at a time.
Yeah, 2 to 3 weeks at a time, something like that. And so as he told her in the film, I won't sit idle. So he always finds something to keep him busy. 2 men approach him about a music gig, about playing the violin in a circus, which seemed more like kind of a Cirque du Soleil type thing and not just a circus. He takes him up on it, and he works for about a week or so, and they go to give him his wages.
Well, and they go down to Washington.
Yeah, in Washington. Yeah.
So it's a traveling show, and they end up, the end of the road is Washington.
Which is interesting because I think it creates this kind of, it really was a divide, right, between North and South,
right,
so to speak. So they take him to Washington, and he performs, and it's apparently an incredible show. They pay him great money. They go out for dinner to celebrate, and it all kind of goes downhill from there. He basically is drugged, or they at least ply him with so much alcohol. Yep. Anyway, he passes out. They take him to bed. The next morning, he wakes up in essentially a barn that's just not far from where they spent the night. And he essentially wakes up and is sold into slavery, along with another woman who's been separated from her children. And we can say more about that later. But he's sold into slavery, and he goes south. But he's sold to Paul Giamatti's character, who then sells him to a guy played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who's a fairly kindly slave owner, if you could put it that way.
A benevolent version.
And he works for him.
But he has some bad men working for him.
He's got some bad men working for him, one of whom is played by Paul Dano. The two get into a confrontation. In fact, Solomon ends up beating him. He's in a fairly dangerous place. Benedict Cumberbatch's character ships him off to another slave owner who is much, much harder. He's played by Michael Fassbender.
And prides himself on being a breaker. He'll break people's spirits.
Anybody. Yeah. He works for him for a long time. And it's basically in that relationship you see the complete and total depravity of the slave system and the horrors visited upon the slaves by the slavers. He spent some time working with him. There's some devastation, like environmental devastation hits his farm. The slaver blames it on the slaves, and so he ships them off to another slave owner who is also a fairly benevolent owner.
He's a judge.
So he stays with him for a time, and then that season is over. That season of work is over, and he goes back to Fassbender's farm. I hate to keep referring to the actors as the slave owners, but I forget the...
It's actually the easiest way to mark the movie is by...
who he's with.
Yeah, the 4 slave owners.
Yeah. So I forget the characters' names, but he's back in this horrible, horrible situation. But one thing has changed, and that's the arrival of what appears to be an itinerant worker / religious figure played by Brad Pitt, who is obviously an abolitionist. But why he's working on this slave farm, we're not exactly sure.
Yeah, it's not clear. So they're putting up a new building. We see it at the end.
Like a new barn.
They're putting up a new building.
Yeah.
And
gazebo.
A gazebo.
Yeah.
And he's clearly a craftsman. And by his beard type and the way he carries himself, the fact that he turns down alcohol, you get the sense that he's from some sort of a pacifist, Anabaptist maybe tradition. So you don't know if he's a Mennonite or if he's Amish or
Quaker.
Quaker. Yeah. Something clearly is going on. He's an intriguing character, and he ends up playing a pretty important role.
Yeah, so he confronts Fassbender's character about the evils of slavery, right? We're all equal in God's sight. He takes, I wouldn't say pity. I mean, he has empathy for Solomon.
Yeah, he's not an agitator.
No.
You wonder at first, like, is he just down there messing around? Because he's clearly not from the South. And,
he says so.
Yeah. And so you think, well, what's he doing down there? Is he literally just a contract laborer? Or, I mean, does he have a bigger plan? But you find out, no, he doesn't have a bigger plan. I mean, it's not like he's working for the cause of abolition some sort of organized way, because when he has the opportunity to act on a slave's behalf, he's pretty nervous about getting involved any deeper than he already is.
Yeah. So this is where if people want to scrub through and not listen to the spoiler, Solomon asks him for a favor. He tells him his story. Anyone has believed him thus far, right? He says, look, I'm
they
really...
changed his name.
Yeah, to Platt.
And so when he says,
I'm Solomon, Northup, everybody says...
It's a tough story to swallow.
Yeah. He tells him, and he takes, I think, a sympathetic ear, Brad Pitt's character, and hears him out, and he says, look, I've got a family, I'm a free man, you can write to any of my friends in Saratoga, and they'll help. They'll come to my aid. And this is what Brad Pitt's character is extremely afraid of, right? Because this is aiding and abetting a runaway slave, which is highly problematic for white people as well, right? But he agrees to do that. And maybe weeks later...
Yeah, you don't know how long.
Yeah. His friend shows up from Saratoga, a store owner who he was friendly with, basically takes him away from Michael Fassbender, says, this man is a free man, I'll fight you in court. He takes him back to Saratoga. He reconnects with his family. He realizes both of his children are obviously grown. His daughter's gotten married, has a son. And then the film basically ends with some after titles that explain more of the story. That's true.
The legal battles that ensued.
Yeah, the fact that nobody really was ever brought to justice over this, and that Solomon Northup died. Nobody knows where or how, which I find really intriguing.
It's an eerie note to end on.
It's a really depressing note to end on.
Because he made the circuit speaking openly and publicly against
He met
slavery.
with a natural end, so to speak. It's really sad.
Right.
So for people who say that, it's a film, he progresses through the slavery, but then he's reunited with his family, and it's a very hopeful, uplifting. Not at all, I don't think. I think it's a very difficult film.
Yeah. So for those of you who skipped to the minute we told you about in the intro, welcome back.
Yeah.
We just did an overview of the film, and now we want to talk about the value of the film as a film. So let's break down a couple elements that films are generally judged by, and let's just talk about how it worked as a piece. For cinematography, for edit, for plot, all that kind of stuff. So, what'd you think of it?
I thought it was really, really good.
I was astounded at the movie as a movie experience.
Yeah. I feel like, so I was familiar with the director Steve McQueen, not Bullitt, not the old school awesome actor, but Steve McQueen, the relatively young British visual artist, that's how he started his career, who has really come out of the gate and made 3 phenomenal films in a row. So I was familiar first with his film Hunger, which is about the hunger strike of a famous Irish prisoner during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A very, very disturbing film. His second film is called Shame, which is about sexual addiction. I've not seen that film. A lot of people's got great reviews. And then now this film, 12 Years a Slave. And from what I've heard about Shame and from what I know about both of these films, I would say he's a fearless filmmaker. Right? So he doesn't take any cheap shots, and he doesn't take the easy way out. And we can say more about this later, but he doesn't take his attention away from the brutalities of the human experience. And in fact, he kind of forces you to watch. So whether or not you look away, he's never going to look away. So I feel like this film works on a level that, say, Django Unchained doesn't work. Okay. Because there's a humorous element to Django Unchained. It's a revenge fantasy. The action is over the top. Tarantino's playing it for laughs and to be really cool. There are also films like Roots or maybe Lincoln or Amazing Grace that have slavery as a topic, as their focus, but they dance around it, right? They never look at the brutality of it up close. Yeah. And I think this is what McQueen does and does very well in this movie.
One of the things I loved, I didn't like it at the beginning, but I grew to love it later, was the use of flashbacks at the beginning. I found it disorienting until I put it together that the character, Solomon, is disoriented. So when he wakes up the next day having been kidnapped and he's disoriented, you've gone on a little bit of a journey with him where you're not exactly sure what's going on or when it is when. And at first I was like, oh, this is really, I don't like when they do this. And then I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's what he's going through. I just thought, and then they never did it again. And so it was like once he got his feet under him, you stayed with him the whole time. And that, I thought, was a brilliant piece of storytelling and really worked to get you unsettled as a viewer so that you could go on this journey with this character.
No, I love that. And I hadn't even really thought about that, but that's where I think he comes across as a great filmmaker and doing something that's rather daring in this day and age, which is actually trusting an audience to get it. Because he never really gives you any visual clues with titles, subtitles, or anything about where you are, when you are. And that he says, okay, I'm going to let you work this out on your own, which makes me wonder if he went with, the creative executives who look at these films and say, well, maybe we need to make this easier to understand. I mean, he's clearly had some sort of cachet, right? He's got some sort of, I don't know if it's final cut or whatever, to say, no, this is how I'm going to tell the story. And it's a great way to do that.
I really appreciated that because there is a number in the title of the movie, 12 Years a Slave, that he never gives it back to us.
That's very good, yeah.
You get it once, and then he will not indulge you again. He doesn't tell you the year, like 1864, but he also doesn't say 2 years later, or you never know. And it's disorienting a little bit because you're trapped in this story. And you're like,
how much longer do we have? How many more years?
How long have we been here, and how much longer do we have? And it's that indefinite time lapse that really makes you stay with Solomon.
Yeah. And then well, maybe it's year 13 when he's back with his family. And you think, man, that was a really, woo. But yeah, I really like that. Yeah. So I think that another thing to say is that, and because you have that feeling, you get that feeling of, man, what a journey. It's because of his willingness to show the brutality of the system.
And I never felt like with a Tarantino film or some other movies I've seen that it was gratuitous.
No,
I don't
exactly.
I never got the sense that he was enjoying displaying this, but that it was always with a little bit of recognition of just the stark reality of existence in that system.
So there are two scenes that we can talk about, and again, one of which is after Solomon lashes out at the overseer. Early in the film, the overseer goes and gets a crony, and they come back and they start to hang him. But another overseer says, that's not your property, and you can't do with Solomon as you please. This is at this point, he's on Benedict Cumberbatch's farm, and says...
who he has found favor with.
Yes. He's like, he's got to punish him for his actions. So he's essentially, they string him up, but the overseer that comes along and stops it doesn't let him down. So he is essentially half hung. He's on his tiptoes. He's having trouble breathing. And through some edits and different things, we never take our eyes off of that. And it runs for several minutes. And he's struggling to breathe. All you hear are the sounds of crickets, farm life, and him choking.
Because all the other slaves just go back to their regular...
No other slave. There are children playing in the background. Slaves are eating and laughing and talking. But they're not going to cut him down because it's not their place. That survival instinct, because if they do that, they're in trouble.
Self-preservation.
Yeah. So later, the owner comes rushing in on his horse and cuts him down and realizes that these men are out to kill him. And that's why he ships him off to the next farm. But that scene could easily have been shortened or...
graphic.
Anesthetized, or it could have been more graphic. But the way he walks this fine line between making it extremely difficult to watch.
It was painful.
And we can say more about this in a moment, but also oddly beautiful in the cinematography.
The way he shot it was visually intriguing.
And this is almost disgusting for me to say, and I'll come back to it in a second. And then the second scene is on the abusive owner's farm, so with the slave owner played by Fassbender. The owner has taken special affection towards a female slave.
A
young female slave. We'll say more about that later too. But the wife is suspicious, as she should be, of his affections towards that slave. And she consistently wants the owner to abuse this young slave girl. A situation arises where he's about to beat her, but now he's going to force Solomon to do his dirty work for him.
One slave to beat another slave.
And he's essentially, I'm going to blow your brains out if you don't do this. And so he starts to whip her. And you can tell that he's holding back, and he forces him to go harder and to lash out at her with much more force. That scene I read this morning before we showed up. That scene runs for 10 minutes, and I didn't realize this at the time, but it's in a single take. And he moves the camera around the post where the young girl's tied up. And you actually see the whip hit her back and explode her flesh, which I don't know that we've seen. Maybe since The Passion of the Christ, which is gratuitous, I would argue.
Yep.
This is not. This is way more disturbing. And so that kind of those visual choices are two things that you need to watch out for and to reflect on that I don't think other filmmakers would do, and it makes for an extremely demanding experience on the part of the viewer, but also conveys the brutality of the system.
He won't let you, like a Tarantino, but he also won't let you turn away.
Yeah. So I think those are two really important things to think about.
Yeah. I was very interested in the movie. About a third of the way in, there's a boat scene where, the camera is at the front of a boat, and it takes you on a little bit of a journey through kind of a southern swamp. And there's no words, and there's nothing else going on. It is a moment where you get to breathe a little bit, and there's Spanish moss hanging down on all the trees. I thought to myself at this moment, Oscar voters they love this, right? That cinematography, they love that stuff. And it was like this moment of sheer beauty in the midst of all of this rampage and terror.
This is what I talk about, that kind of juxtaposition between the nightmarish slave system and then the beauty of the cinematography in the film. And I don't know what to make of it, other than it just makes for an engaging experience.
It's going to be interesting to hear what other people do with it, because we were there to view it critically. We knew that we were going to be asked to write and talk about it. But if you pay money and you go in to see this movie, it's going to be interesting how you respond to that, because the beauty of the actual film, moments like that, in contrast, like you're talking about, with the brutality of the system that's being portrayed, it's not unnerving, but it certainly doesn't let you settle in to enjoy a film.
No, but it's walking this fine line where you said you get a moment to breathe, and it allows this sort of access of like, well, at least this is something, there's some visuals here that are really stunning, okay? Where a film like, I think, Hunger, there is none of that.
No relief.
As far as I can remember, there's no beauty. It's all darkness.
Wow.
And now I feel like I've got to go watch Shame and see how he handles that. But at least in this film, there is an avenue, which some people might find problematic, right? How dare you make this remotely beautiful, right? That's something that I would like to hear from other people, from listeners, or
I guess that would be...
is this problematic? This kind of art house aesthetic applied to slavery.
It's interesting. I think that's a part of the conversation that's going to be, once this gets out in the population as a whole, it's going to be interesting to see how different people respond to different elements of it. You had something you wanted to talk about, the editing. Yeah,
that's another thing, along with the cinematography, that kind of makes that tension between what an amazing film and what a horrific subject. There's a scene early in the film where Solomon is now a slave. The owner is reading out of Scripture, and we'll say much more about this later. But he's reading from Scripture at what is apparently a Sunday service, and it's about kind of the majesty and beauty of creation. It's not a harmful use of Scripture, which we'll get to, which some of the characters use. They edit these two tracks, so to speak, these two scenes that kind of overlap each other, where the very vicious overseer is singing a song to the slaves using the N-word every sentence, which is essentially a warning to them not to run away. And if you do, you better run fast, because you don't want me to catch you. And this goes, and so they overlap that with the Scripture of the Sunday service. And I just found that to be an extremely disorienting but moving or challenging thing. That there are two things going on at once in their experience.
Yeah, you figure out that the slave, let's say on a Friday, is mocked and threatened by the guy who works them during the week, and then they're showing up at what you assume is a mandatory church service on Sunday to hear a sermon from the slave owner who hired that cruel man and knows what he's doing, right? And so, you start to get a little bit agitated about the situation, about the slave's experience of being tormented and threatened, in living in terror and humiliation, and then having to be subjected to a sermon and all of the sermons in the film are delivered by the slave owners. Some of them go well and some of them don't. And so the fact that it started with one that went well, but it was underneath, they kept cutting back and letting you hear the entire time the song that this man is singing. And
which is terrifying.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, just mocking. It's just, so that kind of editing as a storytelling device was impressive.
The audio cues, I mean, the sound. And so I think that, and then there's also, I was going to say, along with that, those editing choices, the score I found to be
What did you like
haunting.
About the score?
The grittiness of it, the kind of haunting aspect to it. And it put me in mind of the score from There Will Be Blood, which I don't know if you've seen that film, but a very raw, gritty, occasionally off-putting score. None of this triumphal stuff. Even when he's reunited with his family, I can't recall there being these swelling music to accompany it. So I think that was another strong point as well. A lot of clanging, a lot of violent music that accentuated the.
When we find out that Solomon is a musician early in the film, I instantly thought, well, I wonder what the music's going to be like through the film. But you actually never get the impression that the orchestration of the score is in any way meant to reflect that musical background. So Solomon,
there's a huge disconnect there. I think that's a good point too.
Even his music goes on a bit of a journey. Obviously, he goes from the heights of this traveling Circus Delay kind of environment, and then the slave owners find out that he can play because it's one of his marketable things that the person who's selling him lets him know that he can fiddle. So he gets to play a couple times throughout the movie. One time he even gets to play at this amazing, lavish ball, and which becomes a whole subplot in itself, in that his owner at that point, his master, lets him keep whatever profits he makes because it makes him look good in the eyes of the other in the social setting, and the other owners. And a slave with money tucked away,
that plays a part later in the film. It
does, and we won't talk about that, but it's because of that musical talent, and yet the score as a whole, not in the scenes where Solomon's playing, but in the other scenes, the music, it's not reflective of that at all.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point too, and I haven't thought about it until now, is that it's his identity as a musician, as a free man, and then as a slave, he's a performer, right? He's this kind of
on command,
play what we tell you to, and the music, I think, changes, right? And it's interesting in that the beginning of the film, he plays at this ball, which is mainly white attendees, but he's very talented. He plays this beautiful classical music. But yet when he goes on the plantation and is forced to play, it's this kind of, I don't know how to put it, but this kind of blackface, folky, kind of hammy music. There's no beauty to it whatsoever.
Yeah, and it's actually what the slave owners prefer because they think that's
fit this role.
So that's their expectation of what, and it's because he has to keep his background undercover, he can't expose himself. He plays in that style. Never kind of
the same way with his intelligence. He has to dance very delicately around that.
Let's talk about the actors.
So I feel like that's something that needs to be said. Is there are great performances all around that really drive the film forward, and a lot of these aren't household names except for one, which I find problematic. Other people don't. But I think you've got a great performance from the lead actor, Chiwetel Ejiofor, who is a London actor, been in a lot of indie films. I think maybe Children of Men, people might remember him from Children of Men. It's a smaller film called Red Belt. But anyway, Love Actually, he was in Love Actually. But it's a great performance. Great performance with his restraint, the quiet way in which he represses everything, and then those few moments where he has to lash out are more effective because of that restraint through the whole thing. Michael Fassbender as this evil slave owner is just unbelievable.
Terrifying.
Yeah, but a great performance. And he's been in all of his films, so there's this working relationship that they have that pays off.
And he's not an over-the-top monster all the time where he becomes a caricature. This guy, he has this steady, aggressive, kind of underplayed intensity that then becomes explosive. And it's because it's not all the time that it is truly terrifying when it surfaces. And
people are going to put this in conversation with this film, in conversation with Django Unchained, for good or for ill, right? Two recent contemporary slave films. Yeah. But if you look at Fassbender's performance in this movie, and then you look at Don Johnson and Leonardo DiCaprio in Django Unchained, it really makes those latter two very, very disturbing, because there was a criticism of those performances. They seem to be having a little too much fun with the use of the N-word, right? And relishing this performance as this kind of evil. You don't get the sense that this is a pleasant experience for the actor. But there's a clear difference in the performance that bears comparison. That even for Fassbender, this seems like a really oppressive role. And I feel like it's a great performance. And then his wife, Sarah, played by Sarah Paulson, who is, I don't think a lot of people are going to talk about her, but she's even more evil than he is, right?
And because of the cultural restraints of that Southern society, she has to be. But what is brewing underneath is even worse than what he has going.
She's the devil.
Yeah,
she is the devil, and I think it's a fine performance, but that character is the devil. And then Brad Pitt shows up, and I think for about 15 minutes the film derails. I know you don't totally agree, but I feel like with these lesser-known actors, not necessarily household names, you have Brad Pitt show up, and you're like, oh, it's Brad Pitt saving the day.
Yeah, I know that.
Brad Pitt produced the film.
Right. And I know...
And it's not a terrible performance. It's just jarring.
I know. When he does show up, I'll admit, I was like, oh, no. Because everyone else, right, is non-superstar. And he's the first superstar who shows up.
Like, big star.
And really, I don't know if it's the clothing he was wearing or the way they lit the scene or the fact that he's building outdoors, but he actually shined. I mean, he almost appears to have like a spotlight on him, when he shows up. And it might just be that he's so famous and that recognition that my eyes, injected that. But I want to say that it reminded me of The Thin Red Line, and a movie that I liked a lot, and no one else that I went to see
That's a good movie.
Liked it.
Yeah.
And one of the things they complained about is that these big name, recognizable actors would show up and you'd never see them again. And I'd be like, yeah, because that's like war. Like if you're a soldier and you see this general, you see him once, you never see him again, right? And so I think that it reminded me of this kind of role where Brad Pitt shows up. And I know that some people are like, oh, here he comes to save the day. But in the role that he played there, I don't know. I thought it worked. And maybe I was just sympathetic because he's Canadian and I'm a dual citizen. And maybe, I don't know. Maybe I was just more sympathetic to it.
Yeah, other people don't have a problem with it. A couple of the early reviews I've read don't really bring it up. So I might be making more out of it than needs to be. But
and speaking of reviews, it's notable that so far, as of the day we're recording this, this movie has a 100% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
With 16 reviews, only a couple of which are really reputable sources.
But 100 on Rotten Tomatoes is like unheard of.
Well, it'll change.
I know.
It'll change.
But I'm just saying it's notable that as of right now, before it goes wide,
all positive reviews.
Yeah. I think that's worth saying. So you wanted to ask a question about who Solomon Northup was in the movie?
Yeah. What I wanted to say is, to me, that is a theological question. For
How
me.
so?
Well, for believers, I feel like our identity is bound up in our relationship to God as created beings.
Okay.
And I feel like that who we say we are as people, as individuals, says a lot about who we believe God to be. To say that Solomon Northup is a free man, despite his race in this film, is to say something about who God is. Then when he is kidnapped and put on a plantation, to say that he is a slave, and the ways in which, I don't know you want to talk about this, the ways in which the slave owner uses Scripture, to say that he is a slave is to say something completely different about who God is.
Oh, I get what you're saying.
So I think when we talk about human identity, we can be talking about theology as well. So if we could say, who is Solomon Northup when we meet him in the film, he's a free man living in Saratoga, New York with a family and children, and free, so far as the movie says, to do as he pleases. I think there are some cues throughout the film that show not everybody thinks he ought to be free in Saratoga, which is important. Maybe they could have enhanced that more. But who is he? He is a free man to do as he pleases, to live his life and to be happy, right?
Yeah, and an interesting tie-in for me is that I lived in Saratoga for 11 years. I was a pastor there for 11 years, and it is probably my favorite place in all of North America.
Wow.
So it's built around these 10 springs. Some are hot springs, some are mineral springs for drinking. It is just a gorgeous place. It, because of those springs, has two legacies. One is that it's a place of healing and health. So people who have been sick, including the founder of my denomination, A.B. Simpson, used to go there to drink the waters and to soak in the baths. So it's always been a place of healing and restoration. The 10 springs were actually shown to the soldiers of the Revolutionary War by the native tribes. They would take wounded soldiers there to soak and to heal their wounds. So it's always been a place of restoration and healing. But the other thing is that they built a big horse racing track there. And it's always also been a place of recreation and a little bit of affluence because of that culture around horse racing. So even up into the Capone era of gangsters, the gangsters had a standing agreement that you didn't bring your guns to Saratoga. So they would actually take a break from, as a vacation from being in the mob, basically, is they would be up there and they would see their rivals, passing on the streets, but they had their kids and their wives, and Saratoga was a safe, this is what I'm getting at, a safe space.
So it was like a respite for...
It was.
Yeah.
So between native tribes taking wounded soldiers from the Revolutionary War there as a safe space, all the way up through the mobsters, I think for me, and no one else would know this, I thought, oh my goodness, he starts in a safe space. Like he's at a place that is so beautiful and so pleasing, and a place of safety. And so knowing what was about to happen, you just think, there's no place you could start that will be in greater contrast to what you're about to go through.
That's a great point. And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And so that is all contributing to who he is as a person, right? To his character. Mm-hmm. But then he goes to the plantation and it's completely different.
Oh, man.
Right?
About as far away as you can get.
And so on the plantation, he is property. He is less than. He's nothing, right? Free to be used and abused. Not free to pursue his own desires and dreams.
They even took away his name.
Yeah. And they repressed everything that made him who he was in Saratoga, right? His artistry, his intelligence, and all that. And they use scriptural passages to craft that new identity. And we all know this, right? We know that slave owners use scripture. Slaves, obey your masters. That's just the first one. And that's used in the film. And the character says, that's God talking, not me. Okay? So bound up in Solomon, now Platt, the slave, his new identity is this understanding of God that is, I would just say, simply evil. What we never, and we see that consistently, and we should, when Brad Pitt shows up, and the first visual cues that he might be Anabaptist or Quaker or Amish, probably not Amish because he wouldn't have left. I think, great. Here we're going to have scriptural affirmation of his identity as a child of God, right? We only get that light in some sort of, it's much more humanist, right? That we're just all deist. Equal, deist, right? There's no specific use of scripture to challenge that, and we never really get that in film anyway.
And I think you're right to say humanist because he's talking about, it's weird because he talks about the value of all humans, that we're all created equal, right? So you use that word created, and there's a God element to it. But what was really driving it was, this uncashed check of promise that we believe these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal.
Yeah. So, because this is a theological podcast, I feel comfortable talking about that relationship between, and I recognize that people who don't believe, right, or maybe have a different belief system, you can still value equality and justice on other, you can still measure that in other ways. So I'm not saying that that's the end-all, be-all of identity. That's just where I'm coming from. And that's the way I read into the film. And that's why I think the film opened up for conversation.
When we, at the end, when we talk about what we expect this film, when it goes wide release, to do, I'll come back to talk about some theological reflections.
Okay.
But it's interesting what you're saying. I didn't know, we hadn't talked before this, I didn't know what you were going to say about those scenes of the slave owners preaching with a Bible in their hand.
Well, and those have to be in there, right?
Oh, yeah.
But what also needs to be in there and is not are those people who, motivated by religion and by a belief in a all-loving God and equality of everybody under the eyes of God, those people aren't in there. And you cannot tell the story of the abolitionist movement apart from those communities. Well, you can, but it's an incomplete story. And we don't really get that in film. You get that a little bit in Amazing Grace, which was about Will Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery in Great Britain. There's clear religious motivation there, but that's also often missing, and I think it's missing in this film as well. But those scenes of slave owners using Scripture to essentially psychologically torment and oppress the slaves should give us pause when we try to use Scripture today to talk about identity politics, right? And that's race, that's sexual orientation, that's gender, that's all those things.
And class.
Yeah, and class. So I don't want to just jump in and say, oh, well, guess what? People who are against gay marriage, go watch this movie because you look like that person, right? You start to look like the slave owner who's abusing Scripture. I'm not saying that. When we talk about identity in any way and try to use, we just need to be extremely careful because it can so easily be used, and we can see historically how easily it's been used to play that game
on both sides.
Is that?
Yeah. So let's go there. One of the things that intrigued me about this film, and what I suspect is going to happen in the cultural conversation, is that I am under the impression, I told you the other night, that I think that there is a deep lying unease because we don't know how to have a conversation that I'm suspicious we really want to have, but don't know how to have. And so, whether it's the election of President Obama, the conservative backlash against him, our disappointment with him becoming unlike what we thought he was going to be by his campaign promises, the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman trial, there are so many elements still of race. We are a racially charged country with a racist heritage and racist systems, institutions still in place, like our prison-for-profit industry. We don't know how to approach that. We're nervous that we're going to open our mouth and get something wrong. So sometimes we don't say what we're really thinking or feeling. So we're hesitant to kind of wade into that conversation. We see people do it badly on Facebook and Twitter, where snark rules the day instead of a generous, thoughtful, ironic approach. And I am under the impression that people want to address this at some level and don't know how. And I think that this movie might be a cultural touch point that allows us to talk about something we know is still a shadow and a specter over our country today. And it's not just historical, but that the lasting legacy of the slave trade haunts us. And we would love, I think, to address it and don't know how. Right? I brought that up the other night, and you said, disagree.
No, I don't disagree.
Okay.
I don't think it's as there are people. I think there are people who, quite frankly, do not want to have that conversation.
Because it's uncomfortable?
Yeah, or because they could say, that's over.
Okay.
No, I'm just raising this.
I know.
So I think it's important what you brought up. I read an article on the film this morning. Who the writer said, I think it was on it was either Complex or Grantland, who said this is the Obama moment movie, and they talked about this because it takes so long to make a movie. So Obama's elected in 2008. So this person made the point. It took Lincoln and Life of Pi, it was like those films took 10 years to make.
Wow.
Right? So it takes an incredibly long time to make any movie.
Wow.
So, and I don't know how long 12 Years a Slave was in the works, but at least 2 to 3 years, right? Pre-production, the whole thing. So that now we're going to start to see these films when in 2008 Obama said we need to have better conversations about race, right? Mm-hmm. We're only now going to start to have those conversations, which is what I think you're saying.
Yeah. And I would just bring two things to the table as, kind of Exhibit A and Exhibit B as I make my case. So I'm going to lay two things on the table. The first thing is that critical race theory, asks the question, how does influence work? How do networks impact that? How do they come together? And so one of the things I pointed out the other night is that it struck me that we're in a private screening for this thing. There's only 15 people in a theater that seats maybe 40. And everybody who's there to see the movie, who has special clearance. I mean, you couldn't even get through the security gate at Fox.
I was momentarily oppressed.
Until somebody called you in.
Yeah.
It was tough to get. It was tough to get on site, to just get on the campus.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was for us who had a special permit to do it.
Okay.
Right. So whoever gets into that room where we saw this, whoever ends up in that theater, you have to ask the question: how did they get in the theater? And the reason that it struck me is we're watching a movie about slavery, and every one of us, the 15 of us who were there, we don't know each other. We're all white. You had to be invited by somebody on the inside in order to get in to see this thing. The only person of color in the entire theater was our security guard. And that stuck out to me because I would say that those networks of power and influence and privilege are a heritage of the legacy of slavery. And there is still something wonky in America that we don't know how to access or address But we know something is still lingering about this cultural divide, that there's still, whether it's, this famous saying that 10 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most divided hour and a segregated hour in America. We know something's wonky. That's my number one. Just that critical theory question of how did we and the people we were with even get in that theater. The second thing is James Cone, in his most recent book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, says that the legacy of the lynching tree and the Jim Crow era, just the terror that lynching wreaked on the African American population, even psychologically, emotionally, culturally, in every way, spiritually. He says the fact that during this 400 years of slavery in America and its fallout, in that 400 years, that the religion that was in place is a religion based on a cross, that the cross is the most significant symbol, icon in the entire Christian religion, the religion that was both in place during slavery, that it was by the slave owners, and since then has continued to be the religion of this culture that is so deeply divided, and that its institutions are so racist that we actually have to make rules and laws to try and bring some type of justice to this unjust disparity. So like affirmative action. Just trying to level out this inherited institutional racism. James Cone says the fact that the cross plays such a central role in the Christian gospel, and yet even Christian ministers and theologians do not have the ability to see its almost paralleled existence with the lynching tree, is telling about the kind of Christianity we have. The cross and the lynching tree are almost identical 2 centuries apart because they were meant to be intimidating. It's not just that it was harmful to the person who got crucified or who got lynched. It was threatening to the population as a whole to say, you stay in your place, you don't challenge the system, and if you are subversive and you threaten the powers that are in place, this is what awaits you. And it's mob, and it's chaos, and it's torture.
This is a great point, because in the film, there's a scene where Solomon, as a slave, is ordered to go to the dry goods store to pick up some items for
the family.
For the family. And on the way, he gets you can tell momentarily, I'm going to use this opportunity, I'm going to run. Mm-hmm. But what does he run into? But 3 white men stringing up 2 black men on a tree. As if there's no fanfare.
Back behind the swamp.
And the moment he sees that, I don't know at what point he reaches his lowest, but that's pretty low. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't know if it's the moment he's forced to whip his fellow slave, but that he sees that, and I think there's a fundamental shift in his mindset about being a slave.
That
he's certainly not going to run away.
Even if he were to break free and he's running through the backwoods, this is what lives back there.
Yeah.
It's not just on the plantation.
Yeah.
It is an ever-present threat that terrorizes psychologically and emotionally and spiritually.
And so why do, when he's half hung on that tree, like I mentioned earlier, why don't his fellow slaves cut him down? What's going on in their mind? Mm-hmm. And I agree with you that we haven't talked about that comparison between the lynching tree and all that represents and the cross. And I think a lot of ministers and people of faith don't do that because I think they have a fundamental misunderstanding of what the cross is to begin with.
I would agree.
Okay? So we celebrate it. Mm-hmm. We idolize it.
Vicarious, violence that makes our life better.
Yeah, and we talk about the redemptive nature of suffering. There's a lot of talk about that in film. Highly problematic. But we have a misunderstanding of the cross. We don't see it in its political, economic, cultural context, which was a tool of oppression and shame, as you mentioned.
I mean, we just had the Reza Aslan event, and Reza's big point, and the reason he calls Jesus a zealot in this, is because he said if the only thing you knew about Jesus was that he got crucified, it would be enough to know that he was a political, subversive, like he got tacked up for sedition.
Yeah.
Is the equivalent, right?
Yeah.
That's the word we would use now, that he was a threat to the powers, the political powers of his day. That's what you need to know. And if that's all you knew about him, like that would be most of what you needed to know about this man.
Yeah. Which begs the question, or how are slaves, let's just in this film, but maybe in American history, what are they a threat to? What puts them on the lynching tree?
That the livelihood of agricultural industry brought about an economic power that would be threatened if you were to, when you get rid of slavery, that just the sheer economics of cotton harvesting, sugar cane, and the other industries that were so prevalent, that slave labor changed the economics of selling those products. And that the profit margin, we know that the profit margin on both cotton and sugar cane is highly dependent on the cost of harvesting and labor.
So could you make comparisons now in our contemporary setting in a capitalist system between, that capitalist system depends on a profit margin that depends on not necessarily slave labor, but certainly as low wage as possible. And are there systems and institutions in place that are fear-based or otherwise that keep people in those positions that drive that machine? Are they race-based? Are they gender-based? Are they class-based? Are they based on economic?
And the reason you're bringing this up is in the context to just remind everybody about why some people may not want to have this conversation I think we so desperately need to have, why they may not be that eager for it, because
they benefit from
the structures of the status quo. The system as it exists now profits some people greatly and causes painful disparity for others.
Yeah. So I think we could easily put to rest why people don't want to have this conversation. And I think you've just done that. Some people don't want to have a conversation because they don't want to acknowledge a place of privilege. They don't want to acknowledge that might come at the expense of other people, which I find inconceivable, because look at the tag on your shirt or the tag on your shoes or the iPhone in your pocket, which we're both holding right now, depends on the exploitation of other people, right? And that is a place of privilege, okay? And that cuts across, at least in America, class, gender. We are all oppressors. And so I can see why a lot of people wouldn't want to talk about that, because that's a difficult thing to do. There are other people who might not want to have this conversation because they would say, look, slavery is over. We live in a free and just society. It's up to you as an individual to make the most out of your situation, essentially have that kind of Protestant work ethic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and succeed. And we can point to people from all walks of life, all ethnicities, all races who have done that. Okay? And so just get with the program and go and move forward. Let's not talk about this, and let's not worry about this or think about these past travesties, because they're in the past. Right? There are people like that, right? We can all think about that. What I'm more interested in is your assertion that there's a conversation that people want to have that they're unable to have. How will this movie enable that conversation? What is it about this film, as opposed to other films, say maybe like Fruitvale Station oh man, that's another one that I think is going to spark a conversation, that has sparked a conversation, that should spark a conversation. That's all about systemic oppression and individual responsibility, right? I think it's a highly important film. But what is it about this film that opens up that conversation? And secondly, what is it do you think people want to say that they can't say? Is there a way that you could give me a for example?
We have in the last decade watched Detroit go downhill in several cities across America, go into bankruptcy. We know that there's something about the inner city, the urban poor, right, that is highly racialized. So we watch that out of the corner of our eye. But we also have a black president. And we wish that were a little cleaner because, there was that early birther controversy where some people said, this guy can't really be American, right? Like whatever their idea of American was, he didn't fit it. And therefore, he was suspect that, so they wanted to know, they wanted to validate, where does he come from? And we wish that had been a little cleaner because, there's the whole Hawaiian thing and the original, and kind of frustrated about that. Both those who wanted to go after him and those who wanted that whole thing to go away. And then we have the Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman thing. Well, that wasn't very clean either because Zimmerman isn't a white guy, right? He's not Aryan, pure race. So that muddied those waters. And Trayvon, as we saw during the trial, it was almost like he was on trial. So if he had just been literally a squeaky clean suburban kid who this happened to, right? Like, so every time a situation like this comes up, right, no matter what it is, these cultural touch points, they're not so cut and dry that they facilitate us being able to make the point or ask the question that we most want to. The water is so muddy, right, that it doesn't give us that satisfaction of giving us a handle with which we can carry around our deep suspicion that even though slavery is over, something is technically still wrong. Why do the inner cities look like they do? Why, when Katrina happened, did the Superdome in New Orleans, why did that look like it did? There's some questions we want to ask that we don't know how to access because the ones we get a hold of aren't as straightforward as we want. And then we hear things like, well, we know slavery is bad, but when you watch this film, this is why I think the film is good.
Why is this?
You watch it and think, I know about slavery, right? But you're going to go, I didn't know it was that bad. And films like Tarantino's film are so cartoony at points that they're easy to dismiss or marginalize and not have to take that seriously. Versus a somber reflection like this, with epic storytelling and fantastic camera work and a masterful musical score, it makes you look at it and not be able to push it aside, but to really be impacted by saying, I didn't know it was this bad. And I'll just say one more thing. I mean, then you find out things like after the Second World War, when those who served were coming home, that there were actually racialized policies by the military for who could access the college fund and for the housing benefits. Then you find out that banks, even in the last century, that banks have this red line where they draw a line around neighborhoods racially about and where they will give loans and where they won't. So there is still inside our institutions, whether it's the military or the banking and the finance industry, there are still racialized policies of discrimination that keep the descendants of former slaves, let's say, from accessing this bountiful American dream. And you know that this legacy of slavery is still haunting us.
So what you're saying is, and I think I'm finally getting at, the other night you and I were having some dissonance around this topic. What you're saying is that there's a film, and that this film is it, that finally takes such a kind of a head-on approach to this part of American history, that it essentially lays a conversational groundwork. It shows the enormity and the severity of that system, and how fundamentally broke a section of society, a whole race of people, that everything from then on has been tainted by it. Mm-hmm. And it allows us to begin to draw these connections, and to simply ask somebody to get over it and move on, and to do, to do the right thing, mm-hmm. To be responsible and live their life. Well, if you are of a certain socioeconomic or racial group, that life has been so stacked against you for centuries, that you're asking somebody to play by the rules of a game, mm-hmm. that are not the same. Mm-hmm. And that's what you're saying, for a point of clarification.
Yeah. Now, when you read, whether it's Bell Hooks or Cornel West or James Cone, you are confronted with the hypocrisy, or at least the deep confusion of claiming that America is a Christian nation when the Christianity that is employed and practiced in America worships the cross and will not deal with its own legacy of its twin, the lynching tree, but simply wants to move on and get back to the game. There are moments, like cultural moments like this film, that give us an opportunity to pause and to reflect and to possibly re-engage the conversation and our participation in the culture differently when we exit the movie theater. And that's what I'm hoping happens. And I think it's interesting that the way this movie is coming out, it's not to a wide release early, that it's going to be released slowly in broader communities. And if it does get an Oscar nod, and I don't see how it won't, that it starts coming onto the radar screen of an entirely different type of viewer.
I think it's a very hopeful approach that you have to the film, that this is going to happen. I'm afraid that there will be viewers who say, yeah, that was then, but this has nothing to do with now. Mm. That will say, yeah, that was awful and everything, but it's not going to lead them to question. Although I agree with you. Mm. You and I agree that it should lead us to re-examine our past and our present. Mm-hmm. I fear that there will be a lot of people for whom it just is a historical memory or reminder, and it's not going to be something that they carry with them. I find that almost impossible, because I find this to be an unforgettable film. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there will be people who walk out and maybe for a day or two like, man, that was tough, and then they just go about their business.
And maybe that's the danger of the medium, is that you can sit in a theater and watch Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or Kill Bill or this movie, and in the end you just walk out and kind of rate it as a film.
So I think the onus is on people like us who say, this is an important movie. How are we? And I think that's maybe what this podcast could be for, what maybe our reviews are for. But for those who get to see this film early, to put in avenues, places that these conversations can be had, whether it's here at the Loft or anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah, so I think it's on people who are maybe people of faith, people who try to think critically about these, need to get out in front of this film and use it as a conversation starter.
Especially if you religiously or spiritually employ the cross as an important element of your religious identity or calendar year or something like that. If the cross is anywhere important to your religious heritage, then I don't see how you can avoid the crossover between, that was a pun.
Yeah.
Between the
I see what you did there.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm a professional. Don't try that at home.
Okay. You might pull something.
But I just don't see how you get away from the legacy of slavery in North America if you are preaching the Christian gospel that has a cross that is so central.
So if I don't know who people of all walks of life listen to this podcast, I'm sure probably a lot of Christians though, right? I think if you're Christian, as you're saying,
What's in the title?
Yeah. Thank you. You have to see this film. Okay.
Yeah.
You have to see the way in which religion has been used, especially as we are increasingly interfaith communities, and there are so many. There are constant portrayals of people of other faiths who are oppressive, and especially if you think about, and Reza was here, if people like to talk about Islam as an oppressive religion, you have to see this film to see the way Christianity has been used and abused in the past. Mm-hmm. And I think, as you're saying, people who hold up the cross, they need to pause and think about the relationship between it and these systems of oppression throughout history. I think historically, contemporary viewers can think about the ways in which Christianity has been used to prop up economic systems. And I think it should force us to look at our current existence and say, what are those systems in place? Not just race-based in America, but around the world. Yeah. What are the systems of oppression that allow us to live the way we live as people of faith and communities of faith, and just as citizens in the 21st century? Yeah. And I think Christians have to be out in front of that, asking those questions. The ways that abolitionists did for 400 years, or for however long that community was there, and then today, what are the things that need to be abolished today, and what luxuries in our life depend on those systems.
So,
and I think this film should force us to do that.
I would go as far as to say, if you wear a cross around your neck or have a cross stuck to your car
or hanging in your house,
you must see this movie or no Christmas presents for you. You owe it to the world that you think we have pretty good authority, that God loves so much, that God sent God's Son. God loves that world. You owe it to that world. Go see this movie.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for talking with me today.
Yeah.
It was fun to flesh out.
Yeah, and I can't wait to see feedback on this, because I can't wait for people to see this, and people could come up and say, you guys are idiots.
Yeah.
Which that happens a lot.
Yeah.
In my own home.
Yeah.
But I want to hear people's feedback. I want to see what we've missed.
Yeah, no, and I wish this movie were out next week, because I can't wait to hear what other people saw that I didn't see, and what their reflection is on what some of the points you and I have made today. Yeah. And as we compare notes on this, I would love to see what comes out of it, but we'll have to wait a little.
We need a loft event around this movie.
All right, dude. So this will be up on Homebrew Christianity. It'll be on Patheos and a number of other.
As soon as we are given the green light.
Yeah. So we will look forward to your feedback. Please feel free to join the conversation. Don't forget to share the brew.